Israeli troops are here to stay in Gaza. This was the message Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu delivered shortly after his security cabinet approved a wider military offensive in the Strip. The plan, sources have told The National, includes pushing the entire population into a small pocket in the south of the Strip, paving way for Israel to take over Gaza indefinitely. It would also see Israel take control of aid controlled by private security groups. The UN and other humanitarian groups have rejected it, saying it puts the population at risk and makes them complicit in Israel's military operation. Speaking to The National, one source described it as a new Nakba, the Arabic word for catastrophe to describe the forced exodus of about 700,000 Palestinians in 1948 to make way for the creation of Israel as a state. Ironically, the events do coincide with the upcoming 77th anniversary of the Nakba, which is marked on May 15th. More details of the offensive are still unclear, but Israel has already called up tens of thousands of reservists to prepare, although operations are not due to begin until after US President Donald Trump's visit to Gulf states next week. The Gazans we have spoken to have told us they fear the worst. They are tired and hungry and desperate since Israel imposed a complete aid blockade 6 weeks ago. Dozens of children have starved to death. Now, people are terrified they will be forced to flee their homes again, or worse, die hungry. Israel's Finance Minister Smotrich said Gaza will be entirely destroyed and that its population will, quote, leave in great numbers to third countries. Neighboring states like Egypt and Jordan have repeatedly objected to any resettlement of Palestinians outside of their homeland. But can Israel's mass displacement campaign actually be stopped? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In this episode, we look at the possible impacts of Israel's new offensive on humanitarian aid systems in Gaza. And we examine the plan from an international law perspective and ask, does it amount to occupation? Aid groups have joined the UN in condemning Israel's operation. The Norwegian Refugee Council, NRC, called it a manipulation of aid to civilians, stating that it will stand by its peers and, quote, refuse to take part in this new scheme. I discussed this with Ahmed Bayram, Media and Communications Advisor for NRC Middle East. I asked him how his organization reacted to the plan.
The plan has been floating about for a while now, and it's not the first time we've heard of it. To us, it's a non-starter because it's a straight violation of international law, and it would, of course, compromise our humanitarian principles. It would undermine everything that we have been trying to do as not just as an organization, the Norwegian Refugee Council, but probably as a community of aid workers, as a community of NGOs, and I would say it would set a dangerous precedent for the entire world. You're talking about decades of humanitarian principles, of neutrality, independence, that would be compromised. And the reason why we are objecting to such plans is because of the risk to civilian lives and to aid workers on the ground.
What exactly is the plan? And what about it would be so bad for the people of Gaza? What about it is compromising the humanitarian principles?
While I can't speak on behalf of the Israeli authorities or the Israeli government, it's clear what we've done by now is that Israel is trying to restructure the aid system so that people can only receive aid from assigned points, or if you want to call them containment zones, confinement zones. Basically, the principle means that you have to go to aid points to receive aid, and that in itself is a big problem because of security, obviously, threats that it puts people in. Our objection to this comes from the fact that it would harm civilians. It would probably also lead to forced displacement because people will only probably move in the direction of aid points or aid hubs. And that in itself is a violation, like we have been saying for a long time now. Our workers on the ground, our aid workers, my colleagues, move around Gaza trying to provide aid to people in their shelters, in their homes. That would be no longer the case with this plan. It would mean that we don't even know even how that is going to look like on the ground. Is it going to be people walking on foot for miles? Is it going to be people carrying food parcels back home? We don't know what the shape and the look of that is going to be. It would change the entire phase of the aid system, really.
So I really want to understand the logistics of this. I know that they're vague and they're murky, as you said, but don't people right now go to, for example, charity kitchens to collect free food? Don't they go to water trucks to collect free water? What is the difference between that and what is being proposed?
First of all, you're right. It's not all aid involves aid arriving to people, except, that in this case, it will be linked to military aims of the conflict. So under this system, Israel would have control of where to place these hubs, the volume of the aid that arrives. It would control the borders. It does now, but it would obviously have even stricter control on the borders. What is being proposed is Israel taking over aid, the type of aid, the volume of aid, the routes of aid, the physical space of aid, who receives aid. All of that would be, in principle, under Israeli control. We have a problem with that right from the get-go. Israel has been trying to take control incrementally. There have been incremental steps from Israel. Israel started with attacking areas where people were receiving aid. It started attacking UN facilities that are protected. It didn't happen overnight. Israel has been destroying this aid system bit by bit and piece by piece. And after that, you look at what's happened with attacks on humanitarian workers, and the attacks never stopped. And now in the end, you hear about the arm twisting almost, of course, the entire community by closing all borders, shutting down all borders, and then coming forward with this proposal, which is a way to put pressure on aid workers to accept.
One of the reasons that Israel says it's doing this is to prevent the aid from falling into the wrong hands, aka what they say, the hands of Hamas. How much of that aid actually does not go to the intended people, knowing that we have seen incidents of looting? But is this such a big phenomenon that it warrants the complete disruption of aid?
I would speak obviously on behalf of the organization I represent, where we have probably some of the most stringent, most strict aid providing rules. The water we provide to 100,000 people almost every single day. These are people who are displaced. These are people who are in shelters. These are people who are living in the open. The education we provide, it's for children who are victims of this war or this conflict. The entire operation is coordinated with the UN, and also it is subject to the most stringent examinations that are done and vetting processes. But if you look at the issues like looting, for example, this is a direct result of the environment that Israel has created. And we noticed over the ceasefire period, when larger flows of aid were arriving, looting rates have gone down. That's what happens in any place where you have total breakdown of law and order, you have gangs thriving or gang elements thriving. You're talking about an entire population that is on the verge of hunger, starvation, and you're basically suffocating every lifeline that they have. And that's a direct result of Israeli practices. But I have to say, for years now, and probably for the entire life of this conflict, aid has been politicized in a way we have rarely seen elsewhere. Now, aid has always been politicized. Now it's being militarized with this Israeli-controlled system that we are looking at.
Ahmed, at the same time, Israel, as the occupying power, actually has the responsibility to facilitate aid distribution in Gaza. So, what happens if Israel says to aid groups on the ground, you know what, guys, you just go home and we'll take care of everything? Doesn't that work?
Their responsibility is to make it safe for us to work. It's not for them to take over aid. And just imagine any party to a conflict in the world taking over. If that becomes a practice, you would have conflicting parties taking over distribution of aid. That would be something we can't even imagine. Probably we shouldn't.
The NRC said it would stand by humanitarian principles and refuse to take part in the new scheme and urges donors to do the same. What are the tools or mechanisms does the NRC and other groups have within their power to circumvent this scheme? Would there be a scenario where you have to just dismantle your operations altogether or band together and do a sort of boycott? Or what are the options here?
We always rely on raising our voice and on advocacy as a big tool in this conflict. And we have seen so many times it does work when you put pressure. But we know that the key to these decisions are probably in a handful of capitals in the world, which is why we need to keep pressuring those capitals in the West mainly. Throughout this Gaza conflict, when it comes to humanitarian issues, we have seen it work and we have seen it go really badly. When it works like we wanted, it's always a result of these collective voices coming out and calling for action. This time, it's probably more than any time before. We need someone to be the sound of reason among these governments and these countries. But I think we are at a very dangerous junction here, and I think the world has to realize that.
The Israeli plan has caused much outrage across the world, including among Western allies. The likes of France and the UK expressed concerns that it would violate humanitarian law. UN agencies and aid groups say they refuse to be complicit in the weaponization of aid. So, what international laws and principles does Israel risk violating in its proposed offensive? I speak about this with Saul Takahashi, an international human rights lawyer who used to work with the UN Human Rights Agency in Palestine. Saul, for the past 19 months, Palestinians have been displaced again and again. From a legal point of view, what is it about this new plan that's different from previous forcible evictions of Palestinians?
If you look at the legal details, then there are some differences in that I think up till now, in general, the Israelis, they would order evacuations in particular parts of Gaza and they would tell them to go to certain areas, other areas in Gaza. And they would say that this would be a temporary thing for security purposes. That's basically the magic term in international humanitarian law. And it is widely, almost universally abused. But basically, legally, yes, there has been a little bit of difference in the sense that up till now, Israel has pretended that these evacuations are going to be temporary. And now they basically come out and said, no, actually, you know what, they're not going to be temporary. We're just going to walk in and we are going to occupy all of Gaza. So I think that's probably one of the factors behind what you could call sort of an increased reaction. But look, anybody who has been watching what is going on in Palestine, and not just since October 7th, 2023, but since 67, since 1948, anybody will tell you that's always been the Israeli goal. I might almost say it's almost refreshing that they're coming out and actually admitting this almost. They're not admitting to ethnic cleansing using so many words. They are saying, oh, yeah, it's going to be voluntary. Any kind of emigration of the residents of Gaza will be voluntary. But look, you've really got to be born yesterday to believe any of that.
For more than 6 weeks now, we know that Israel has imposed a blockade on the Strip, effectively banning anything from coming in. The Israeli defense minister has said that this was a, quote, pressure lever against Hamas. Are there any legal exceptions during wartime that would, in fact, allow a warring party to block aid the way that Israel is doing right now?
In this kind of blanket matter, the quick answer is no, there isn't. You can't just block any kind of humanitarian aid from going to a population during armed conflict, A. B, the other thing that we have to always keep in mind is that the Palestinians of Gaza and all of Palestine, frankly, they are under occupation. And as the occupying power, Israel has special obligations, not just the sort of normal obligations under international humanitarian law during armed conflict to facilitate and make sure people get adequate aid, but they also have special obligations towards them. The Palestinians, under international humanitarian law, they are afforded special protection because they are occupied by a foreign power. Now, again, Israel has never even pretended to comply with this.
Under the new plan, Israel said it would be in control of aid and the distribution of it. You mentioned Israel is the occupying power and has the responsibility of facilitating aid. But aid groups have told us that this still amounts to a violation of humanitarian principles. Can you explain why?
Well, within this context, it's very easy to see what's going to happen. Israel is already saying that it will, in this plan, it will provide aid to approved families, I think was the language, or approved representatives of families. And if we've seen the context of how Israel has blockaded and prevented adequate supplies and aid from going into Gaza since 2007, it's very easy to see what's going to happen. They are going to use aid as a leverage to prevent, basically they are going to say, oh yeah, this family is somehow in some sort of indirect way connected with Hamas. They're not going to provide any kind of evidence and they're going to cut them out of the aid. Whatever it looks like on paper, it's very clear what's going to happen in practice. And that's I think, one of the main reasons that most of the aid agencies are rejecting this plan.
The idea of the plan is that there would be private US companies that would be entrusted with the distribution of aid under Israeli supervision. Could having an outside third party be more palatable for aid organizations? Would this actually help them do their work without feeling like they're violating ethical principles?
Well, I guess that's probably the intention. That's probably why the Israelis threw in that part about American companies being commissioned for this. But it's the same thing. If these guys are going to be operating under the supervision of the Israelis, they're going to be screening Palestinians out on undisclosed and arbitrary criteria, then no, it's not going to make a difference. It doesn't matter who the guys are who drive in the trucks and distribute the aid. The point is that people who need aid, they have to be able to get this aid. And the way the Israelis have set this up, again, you'd have to have been born yesterday to believe that there's any serious intention that they have of doing that.
Israel said it would enter Gaza and not leave in this offensive, essentially saying it's going to be there indefinitely as far as we know. Would this be officially and legally considered an occupation of Gaza then?
The International Court of Justice has already stated its view. The Israeli occupation of the 67 territories of the West Bank and Gaza. In particular, they were looking at the West Bank. Basically, they've said that this occupation has gone so long, and the policies and practices of the Israelis are such that basically it's de facto annexation that they have been gunning for quite a long time. Gaza is an integral part of the 67 territories. Gaza is an integral part of the territory of Palestine, which is slotted to be an independent Palestinian state recognized by the international community. So you can't separate Gaza from the West Bank. It just doesn't work like that. But what the Israelis have argued in the past, they evacuated the one small colony that they had within Gaza. They evacuated the Israeli military bases, and they said, okay, we've washed our hands, got nothing to do with it anymore, and it's not occupied. But that argument doesn't fly at all, and it's never flown internationally, legally speaking. The UN has always recognized Gaza as continuing to be occupied by Israel because, okay, you don't have military presence there, but that in itself is not enough. If you go to Gaza, then, well, obviously not now, but before October 2023, you can see what I'm talking about. The whole place is completely fenced off. There are Israeli drones, Israeli warplanes flying overhead. They can and did come in and assassinate people and blow up buildings whenever they felt like it. The mobile network is held by the Israelis. The population registry is held by the Israelis. Gazans are prohibited from going out into the sea to fish and make a living. So Israel still basically held overwhelming power over the territory, and that really is the definition of occupation. Now, this, what this will amount to, we have to see, but certainly it looks like they're talking about permanently taking the land, recolonizing it with Israeli colonial settlements. And so basically the West Bankification of Gaza, if you like, seems to be the objective. But all of this is completely unacceptable, legally speaking.
So what's the actual difference between occupation, colonization, and annexation? Because these words seem to be used more or less interchangeably, but there are important differences there.
Yeah, legally there are subtle and important differences. So, like occupation, you have two countries, there's an armed conflict, and in the course of the armed conflict, one country occupies militarily another part of the other country. Now, first of all, the laws of occupation completely prohibit the colonization of the land, right? It's like you can't just move in, take over land, and build cities only for your own people, which is exactly and precisely what Israel has been doing. But annexation is also a complete violation of international law beyond the law of occupation, because annexation, that is when a country marches in, takes over the territory, and says, okay, occupied territory remains your territory. We have to negotiate about it. But this ain't your territory anymore. This is ours. We're never going to give it back, and we have sovereignty over this land. Basically what Israel has done with East Jerusalem. They, after occupying it in 1967, they declared it unilaterally to be part of the State of Israel. Now, what the International Court of Justice basically has decided is that, look, occupation is a short-term thing. This is very clear. It's only meant to last for a few years until the two warring parties sort of come to an agreement. However, what Israel is doing is not just holding on to the land. It is colonizing it. It's actively colonizing it. It is annexing the territory. So what the ICJ has said, the International Court of Justice has said is, look, you can't call this occupation anymore. You're trying to annex this. So that's why it's illegal. You have to stop and you have to leave.
Beyond conversations that actually happen within UN chambers and UN statements saying that they're going to boycott their involvement in such a plan, is there anything they can do beyond words? Because when push comes to shove and the US gets approval for its plan, who is to stop it from happening?
I mean, there is, but that would be up to the Security Council. And that's the problem with the way that the UN has been set up as an international institution. The only part of the UN that can order countries to do things and enforce international law through, if necessary, the use of military force. The only body is the Security Council. And as we see, because of the American veto on any kind of serious action against Israel, it's very difficult to see them then happening. So we go back to, for example, the General Assembly. And yes, like you said, it seems like it's just something that takes place in a big meeting room and in the chambers, but it can have real life effects. Whether it has real life effects right now towards the delivery of aid, that's something that we have to see. But holding Israel accountable is going to be necessary, no matter what happens. And really, it's up to the member states of the General Assembly, I think, to really show that they're going to put some teeth into what they've been talking about. Are they going to put their money where their mouth is? Are they really going to do the necessary, hold Israel accountable, levy sanctions on the state of Israel? Or are they just going to, wring their hands and issue statements?
That's it on Beyond the Headlines. This episode was produced by Ben Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer and Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. Thank you for listening. Follow our coverage on everything Israel-Palestine related on thenationalnews.com.